Run your tongue along your back teeth right now. If you feel a filling, you're normal. If you don't, you're rare. Now here's the part that should actually bother you. Pull a human skull out of the ground that's 8,000 years old, and there's a real chance its teeth are in better shape than yours. Straight, full set, not one cavity. That's not a rare, lucky skeleton. For almost the entire time our species has existed, that was just what a human mouth looked like. Something broke it. And it wasn't evolution, because evolution doesn't move fast enough to explain what happened to human teeth. This happened in the blink of an eye, historically speaking. And once you see the mechanism behind it, you'll understand why your dentist has a job at all. Let's start with a number that sounds fake, but isn't. Skeletons from before farming existed show cavity rates as low as 1 to 2% of teeth affected. Modern populations sit at the opposite extreme, with the majority of adults affected, and in some countries over 90% of people carrying at least one cavity by the time they're grown. That's not a small gap. That's close to 100 times worse in a condition we've somehow decided is just a normal part of having teeth. So what actually happened? The honest answer is agriculture, and it's a rougher answer than it sounds. For roughly 200,000 years, humans ate meat, fish, wild plants, roots, and tough fibrous vegetation. Then, starting around 10 to 12,000 years ago at different times in different places, humans started farming grain, wheat, barley, rice. And with that came something human teeth had never really had to deal with before, a constant, daily supply of sticky, starchy, fermentable carbohydrate sitting on the teeth every single meal for the rest of a person's life. Here's why that's a problem at the bacterial level. The organisms that cause tooth decay feed on that leftover starch and sugar and convert it into acid. Acid eats enamel. Someone gnawing through tough dried meat wasn't leaving much behind for that bacteria to work with. Someone eating porridge or bread daily was feeding that colony non-stop. And you can watch it happen in the fossil record like a before and after photo. Researchers comparing skeletons from right before farming to skeletons from right after, sometimes only a few generations apart in the exact same region, see cavity rates spike almost immediately. Agriculture didn't just change what people ate, it changed the chemistry inside the human mouth, fast enough to leave a visible line in the archaeology. But cavities are only half of it. The other half is shape, and this is where it gets genuinely strange. Look at a modern jaw, and there's a decent chance it's too small for the teeth it's supposed to hold. That's the entire reason wisdom tooth removal is one of the most common surgeries performed on teenagers on the planet. Roughly 85% of people will lose at least one because there simply isn't room. Ancient skulls almost never have this problem. Hunter-gatherer jaws regularly show every tooth fully erupted, properly spaced, straight, without a single day of orthodontic work. It's not that ancient humans had some superior jaw gene, it's that their jaws were built by a mechanical process ours never gets to finish. Chewing is a stress signal, the same way lifting weight is a stress signal to muscle. A hunter-gatherer child grew up chewing tough dried meat and fibrous, raw, resistant food for hours a day, starting the moment they had teeth. That repeated force is what tells the jawbone how large to grow. It's a developmental instruction, not a fixed blueprint. Modern processed soft food removes almost all of that mechanical stress, and the jaw responds exactly the way undertrained muscle would. It grows smaller than it was built to. The teeth themselves, controlled by a more fixed genetic program, don't shrink to match. You end up with a jaw that quit growing early, trying to hold a full set of teeth that never got the same memo. This isn't just theory pulled from old bones. A dentist named Weston Price spent the 1930s traveling to 14 countries chasing this exact pattern in living people, not skeletons. In isolated communities eating traditional, unprocessed, physically demanding diets, he found straight teeth and almost no decay, generation after generation. Then he found the children of those same communities one generation later, after refined flour and sugar reached their villages. Crowded teeth, cavities in one generation, same genetics different food, about as close to a controlled experiment as history has ever handed us by accident. Here's a detail almost nobody thinks to ask about, and it ties the whole picture together. Bite alignment. Ancient skulls very often show an edge-to-edge bite, where the upper and lower front teeth meet flat against each other, instead of the upper teeth overlapping the lower ones the way most modern mouths are built. That edge-to-edge bite comes directly from a lifetime of heavy chewing, wearing the teeth down evenly and pulling the jaw into that exact position through pure, repeated use. Once food got soft, that wear pattern vanished, and the overbite most of us now consider completely normal became the default. Not because it's a better design, but because nothing was left demanding the jaw develop the older way. Put the three pieces together and this stops looking like coincidence. Fewer cavities because there was nothing sugary sitting on the teeth for bacteria to convert into acid. Full-sized jaws with room for every tooth because childhood chewing was hard enough to trigger complete bone growth. Even the bite itself, shaped directly by mechanical demand from a diet that barely exists for most people alive today. Here's the mirror. We picture ancient humans as the rough draft and ourselves as the finished version. But somewhere in the last few thousand years, in exchange for convenience, softer food, and civilization itself, we quietly downgraded one of the most basic systems in the human body, and we did it so gradually that every generation just assumed crowded teeth, cavities, and wisdom tooth surgery were simply what a mouth is supposed to do. Your ancestors never needed a dentist. Not because they were tougher, because their food was still doing a job yours stopped doing generations ago. But here's what most people get wrong about ancient teeth. It's not that ancient humans never had dental problems. It's that when they did, they didn't just suffer through it quietly. And the evidence of that is stranger than almost anything else in this story. At a site in Slovenia, archaeologists found a human jawbone roughly 6,500 years old with a cavity that had been packed with beeswax. Not decoration, not ritual. A filling. Someone identified a rotting tooth, cleaned it out as best they could, and sealed the hole with beeswax to stop the pain and slow the decay, using a substance and a method that, structurally, isn't that different from what a dentist does to you today. In Pakistan, at a site called Mewing, researchers found something even more direct. Teeth from roughly 9,000 years ago with tiny, precise holes drilled straight into them. Evidence of one of the earliest forms of dentistry ever discovered. Not decoration, drilling into a live tooth with stone tools. While the person was almost certainly conscious for it, sit with that for a second because it reframes everything. We tend to imagine ancient humans avoiding dental problems entirely because their diet protected them. And, mostly, it did. But when the system failed, when a cavity did form, when an abscess did take hold, there was no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and no walking away from it. An infected tooth in the ancient world wasn't an inconvenience. Left untreated, it could kill you. The infection spreading into the jaw, into the bloodstream, into the brain. So someone, without any concept of germ theory, without a single tool designed for the job, worked out that drilling into a dying tooth and packing a wound with beeswax could ease unbearable pain and possibly save a life. That's not primitive. That's problem solving under conditions that would break most modern people within the first 5 minutes. Which brings up a question worth sitting with. If ancient humans had access to that level of practical medical reasoning 10,000 years ago, why does modern dentistry still treat crowding and misalignment as something you're just born with instead of something that happens to you? That question is exactly what a controversial but increasingly visible field called orthotropics is built around, and it's worth understanding because it directly picks up where the chewing and jaw growth story left off. The core claim, championed most visibly by a British orthodontist named Mike Mew, is that modern jaw and facial development isn't primarily genetic at all. It's postural and mechanical. Constant mouth breathing, low tongue posture, and a lifetime of soft food, the argument goes, actively train the face and jaw to grow narrower, longer, and more crowded than they're supposed to. The proposed fix involves things like keeping the tongue pressed to the roof of the mouth and breathing through the nose, popularly nicknamed mewing online. Now, to be direct about it, this is genuinely contested territory. Mainstream orthodontic and medical bodies have pushed back hard on strong claims made by mewing advocates, particularly the idea that posture alone can meaningfully reshape adult bone structure, and there isn't strong clinical evidence supporting the more dramatic claims circulating online. But the underlying premise that jaw development is shaped far more by mechanical forces during childhood than we've historically assumed lines up almost exactly with what the archaeological record already shows us in hunter-gatherer skulls. The disagreement isn't really about whether mechanical force shapes the jaw. The bones already answered that question thousands of years ago. The disagreement is about how much of that process can still be influenced or reversed once you're already an adult, and that's a much harder question to answer with certainty. Let's make the actual difference in a day's chewing concrete, because tougher food undersells what we're actually talking about. A hunter-gatherer child's daily diet might have included things like raw or lightly cooked wild tubers, dried strips of meat that had to be torn and ground down through sheer repeated force, nuts still in shells that required cracking with the back teeth, and fibrous wild greens that needed real mechanical breakdown before they were even swallowable. Every one of those foods demanded dozens of minutes of hard, repetitive jaw work per meal, multiple times a day, every day, for years during exactly the window when the jawbone is most responsive to mechanical signals. Compare that to a typical modern child's day: bread, pasta, ground meat, purees and soft fruit, foods engineered often quite literally for minimal chewing effort, because that's what makes them palatable, fast, and easy to produce at scale. The jaw isn't being asked to do the work it evolved expecting to do. It's not that modern children are chewing wrong, it's that they're barely being asked to chew at all compared to what a body still running on 100,000-year-old developmental instructions is expecting. That gap, dozens of minutes of hard mechanical loading per day versus almost none, compounded across the exact years when bone is most plastic and responsive, is the entire mechanism behind why an 8,000-year-old skull can have straighter teeth than the person sitting next to you right now. Here's the wider mirror, and it's bigger than teeth. Every time humans traded a harder, more demanding version of an activity for an easier one, we tended to assume we were purely winning. Softer food, less physical effort, more convenience. And in most ways, we were. Life expectancy climbed. Famine became rarer. Food became abundant instead of desperately fought for. But biological systems built over hundreds of thousands of years don't renegotiate their requirements just because civilization changed the rules overnight. The jaw still expects hard, repeated mechanical work in childhood. It doesn't know that bread exists. It doesn't know that food comes from a store instead of the ground. It's still operating on the old contract, and every generation that doesn't fulfill that contract ends up with the bill. Crowding, impacted wisdom teeth, and a dental industry that exists largely to manage the gap between what our bodies expect and what modern life actually gives them. Your ancestors weren't tougher than you. They weren't given better genes, and they definitely didn't have better tools. What they had was food that never let their jaw or their teeth forget the job they were built to do. Somewhere in the last few thousand years, we solved hunger and traded away that job in the process, so quietly that by the time any of us were born, a mouthful of problems already looked completely normal.